The carriage wheels rattled against the cobblestone streets of Charleston as Thomas Blackwood peered through the window at his new surroundings. July 1839 brought merciless heat to South Carolina, and even in the evening the air hung heavy and still. Thomas dabbed his handkerchief against his brow, the fabric already damp with sweat despite the sun's descent below the horizon. "Almost there, sir," the driver called back. "Magnolia Manor just ahead." Thomas had travelled from Boston to accept a position as a tutor for the daughters of Elijah Thornton, one of Charleston's wealthiest plantation owners. The position promised generous compensation and respectable quarters, an opportunity that would allow him to send money back to his ailing mother in Massachusetts. As the carriage approached wrought iron gates, Thomas glimpsed the manor for the first time. A grand three-story structure with imposing white columns and verandas wrapped around each level. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees that lined the long driveway, swaying gently in the evening breeze like ghostly fingers. "Magnificent, isn't it?" The driver's voice broke Thomas's trance. "The Thornton estate is the pride of Charleston." Yet something about the property sent a chill down Thomas's spine, despite the oppressive heat. Perhaps it was the stark contrast between the pristine white facade of the main house and the row of small, weathered cabins visible in the distance. The slave quarters, a reminder of the institution that Thomas, like many northerners of his time, found increasingly troubling. The carriage came to a stop before the front steps. Thomas collected his belongings and ascended toward the entrance, where an elderly butler awaited him. "Mr. Blackwood, welcome to Magnolia Manor. I am Frederick, head of the household staff. Mrs. Thornton is expecting you in the drawing room." Thomas followed Frederick through the grand entrance hall, noting the portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to track his movement, disapproving of this northern intruder in their southern domain. The drawing room was elegantly appointed, with French furniture and fine silk draperies. Standing by the fireplace was a woman of perhaps 40 years, her posture impeccable, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back severely. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume." Her voice was melodious yet cold. "I am Mrs. Eleanor Thornton. My husband is away on business in Savannah, but sends his regards." Thomas bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Mrs. Thornton. I'm grateful for the opportunity to tutor your daughters." "Yes, Charlotte and Elizabeth require a proper education. They've exhausted our previous tutor's knowledge." Something in her expression suggested this wasn't entirely a compliment to her daughter's intellect. "You come highly recommended from Harvard. I trust you'll find your accommodations satisfactory." A young black woman entered silently, keeping her eyes downcast. "This is Ruth," Mrs. Thornton said dismissively. "She will show you to your quarters and attend to your needs." As Thomas followed Ruth from the room, he noticed a door slightly ajar across the hall. Through the crack, he glimpsed a girl of perhaps 16, watching him with wide, fearful eyes before the door quickly closed. Ruth led him to the east wing of the house, to a well-appointed room on the second floor. "Your room, sir," she said quietly, still avoiding his gaze. "Thank you, Ruth," Thomas replied, setting down his case. When she didn't immediately leave, he added, "Is there something else?" Ruth hesitated, glancing nervously at the open door. "Be careful here, sir," she whispered, so softly he nearly missed it. "Things at Magnolia Manor aren't what they seem." Before Thomas could question her, she hurried from the room, leaving him alone with her cryptic warning and the distant sound of a woman's muffled sobs echoing from somewhere deep within the manor's walls. That night, Thomas found sleep elusive. The unfamiliar sounds of the southern night, cicadas chirping, the occasional distant wail that might have been a screech owl, kept him alert. But it was Ruth's warning that truly occupied his mind. What wasn't as it seemed at Magnolia Manor? And whose were the sobs he'd heard? Morning arrived with blinding sunlight streaming through Thomas's window. After dressing, he followed Frederick's directions to the breakfast room, where he would meet his pupils for the first time. The sisters were already seated at the table when he entered. Charlotte, the elder at 16, had her mother's sharp features softened by youth. Elizabeth, perhaps 14, was smaller and appeared more delicate, with a nervousness about her that manifested in constantly fidgeting hands. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte greeted formally, her posture perfect. "We hope you found your first night at Magnolia Manor comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Thomas replied, taking the seat indicated by Frederick. "I look forward to beginning your lessons today." Mrs. Thornton entered, commanding the room's attention immediately. "Mr. Blackwood, I see you've met Charlotte and Elizabeth. They will be your primary responsibility, though occasionally you may be asked to provide some basic instruction to the household staff's children as well." This last part was added with obvious distaste. Breakfast proceeded with stilted conversation. Thomas noted that Elizabeth barely spoke, responding only when directly addressed, and even then with just a few whispered words. Charlotte, meanwhile, carried herself with the poise of someone much older, answering questions about her interests in literature and music with rehearsed precision. After the meal, Thomas followed the girls to the manor's library, a magnificent room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and large windows overlooking the garden. Here, their lessons would take place. "Your previous tutor left rather abruptly," Charlotte remarked as she selected a volume from the shelf. "Mother says he was inadequate, but the staff whispers otherwise." "Charlotte," Elizabeth hissed, her eyes widening in alarm. "What do they whisper?" Thomas asked, curiosity piqued. Charlotte's lips curved into a small, secretive smile. "That he saw something he shouldn't have in the West Wing." She exchanged a glance with her sister. "We're not allowed there. Neither are you, Mr. Blackwood. Mother was quite specific about that, wasn't she, Lizzie?" Elizabeth nodded vigorously. "Please don't go there," she whispered, genuine fear in her voice. Thomas was about to inquire further when the library door opened and Ruth entered with a tea tray. "Your morning refreshment," she announced, setting the tray down. As she poured the tea, Thomas noticed bruising around her wrist, partially concealed by her sleeve. Ruth caught his gaze and quickly tugged the fabric down. After she departed, Thomas attempted to redirect the conversation to their studies, but his mind kept returning to the forbidden West Wing and Ruth's bruises. What secrets did Magnolia Manor hold? The morning passed with assessments of the girls' knowledge. Charlotte proved exceptionally bright, particularly in literature and languages. Elizabeth excelled in mathematics, but struggled with confidence, often looking to her sister before answering questions. As they broke for the midday meal, Thomas observed the sisters' interaction. Charlotte maintained a protective stance toward Elizabeth, yet there was something controlling in her manner, as if she were guarding not just her sister, but information as well. After lunch, Mrs. Thornton informed Thomas that the girls had music practice, giving him a few hours to himself. "You may explore the grounds if you wish," she offered. "Frederick can show you the gardens. They're quite lovely this time of year." Her tone made it clear this was not merely a suggestion, but a directive on how he should spend his free time. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. I would enjoy seeing the gardens." As Frederick led him outside, Thomas caught sight of a man on horseback approaching the house, tall, broad-shouldered, with a bearing that suggested authority. "Mr. Thornton has returned early from Savannah," Frederick observed, a note of surprise in his voice. Thomas watched as Elijah Thornton dismounted, handing the reins to a waiting slave. The plantation owner's gaze swept the property before landing on Thomas. Even at a distance, Thomas could feel the weight of that stare, assessing, calculating, and somehow threatening. "Come, Mr. Blackwood," Frederick urged, suddenly eager to move away. "The rose garden is this way." As Thomas followed, he glanced back to see Thornton still watching him, a predatory stillness to his stance that sent another chill down Thomas's spine despite the scorching summer heat. Dinner that evening was an exercise in calculated politeness. Elijah Thornton sat at the head of the table, a commanding presence with his silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating grey eyes. Though he smiled and engaged in pleasant conversation, there was a coldness beneath his charm that put Thomas on edge. "Harvard, you say?" Thornton remarked, cutting into his roast duck with precision. "An excellent institution. And what brings a northern academic to Charleston? Surely there are positions closer to home." "The opportunity seemed ideal," Thomas replied carefully. "And I've always been interested in experiencing different parts of our country." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Different indeed. You'll find we have our own way of doing things in the South, Mr. Blackwood. Our own traditions to uphold." Mrs. Thornton watched this exchange with an impassive expression, while Charlotte maintained her perfect posture, occasionally glancing at her father with what Thomas recognized as carefully concealed apprehension. Elizabeth kept her eyes fixed on her plate, barely touching her food. "Mr. Blackwood will need to understand our expectations regarding the girl's education," Mrs. Thornton interjected smoothly, "particularly our emphasis on proper comportment and the social graces appropriate for young ladies of their station." "Of course," Thornton agreed, "though I trust he won't neglect the classics. A lady should be accomplished, but never pedantic." He turned his attention to Charlotte. "Have you practiced your French composition as I instructed?" "Yes, father," Charlotte replied. "Mr. Blackwood has already noted my progress." "Excellent." Thornton's gaze shifted to his younger daughter. "And you, Elizabeth, have you overcome your shyness with our new tutor?" Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she answered, "I'm trying, father." "Try harder," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Timidity is a most unattractive quality in a Thornton." The remainder of the meal proceeded with Thornton dominating the conversation, expounding on local politics and business matters. Thomas noted how the entire household seemed to orbit around the man, adjusting their behavior to his moods and preferences. After dinner, Thornton invited Thomas to join him for brandy in his study, an invitation Thomas understood was actually a command. The study was masculine and imposing, with dark wood paneling and hunting trophies mounted on the walls. A large desk dominated one end of the room, covered with ledgers and correspondence. "Sit, Mr. Blackwood," Thornton instructed, pouring 2 snifters of amber liquid. "I believe in being direct with those in my employ. You come from the North, where certain opinions regarding our way of life prevail." Thomas accepted the brandy cautiously. "I assure you, Mr. Thornton, I'm here simply as a tutor." "Indeed, and that is all you shall be." Thornton's voice hardened. "The education of my daughters is your sole concern. The management of my household and my property is mine alone." The implication was clear. Thomas was to ignore whatever he might witness regarding the treatment of the enslaved people on the plantation. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Thornton leaned forward. "Charleston society has certain expectations, Mr. Blackwood. The Thornton name carries weight and responsibility. My daughters will marry advantageously and continue our legacy. Your task is to prepare them for that future, nothing more." Thomas nodded, uncomfortable with the conversation, but aware of his precarious position. "Excellent." Thornton leaned back, seemingly satisfied. "Now, there is one more matter. The west wing of the house is private. Family only. There's no reason for you to venture there." "Charlotte mentioned similar restrictions this morning," Thomas acknowledged. Something flashed in Thornton's eyes. Anger, perhaps, or concern. "Did she? How interesting. My daughter should know better than to discuss family matters with staff." He set down his glass with deliberate care. "Remember your place here, Mr. Blackwood. Those who forget often find themselves seeking new employment, or worse." The threat hung in the air between them as Thornton dismissed him with a wave of his hand. That night, Thomas was again awakened by sounds, this time not sobs, but heated voices. Approaching his door, he could make out Thornton's angry tones and Mrs. Thornton's quieter responses. They seemed to be arguing about the arrangement and the doctor's visit. As their footsteps receded down the hall toward the forbidden west wing, Thomas made a decision. Whatever secrets Magnolia Manor held, He was now determined to uncover them. 3 days passed in a semblance of routine. Thomas taught the sisters, dined with the family, and carefully observed the dynamics of Magnolia Manor. Thornton was frequently absent, attending to business in town or inspecting the fields where slaves toiled from dawn until dusk. During these absences, a subtle tension eased from the household, though Mrs. Thornton maintained her rigid oversight. On the 4th night, Thomas was awakened by a soft knock at his door. Opening it cautiously, he found Ruth standing in the darkened hallway, a finger pressed to her lips. "Please, sir," she whispered. "She needs help." "Who needs help?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice low. Ruth glanced nervously down the corridor. "Come quickly. Everyone's asleep." Against his better judgment, Thomas followed her through the silent house, down the main staircase and toward the kitchen. From there, they slipped through a side door that led to a narrow path connecting the main house to the slave quarters. The night was moonless, the only light coming from a few stars peeking through gaps in the cloud cover. Cicadas created a wall of sound that would mask their footsteps, but the humidity made the short walk uncomfortable, Thomas's nightshirt clinging to his skin within moments. Ruth led him to the farthest cabin, its windows dark. She knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, before pushing the door open. Inside, a single candle illuminated a sparse room. On a thin pallet in the corner lay a young woman, perhaps 18, her face contorted in pain. An older woman sat beside her, bathing her forehead with a damp cloth. "This is Mercy," Ruth whispered to Thomas. "She's with child, and the baby's coming early. Martha's been trying to help, but something's wrong." Martha, the older woman, looked up at Thomas with suspicious eyes. "Why'd you bring him here? He's one of them." "No," Ruth insisted. "He's different. I've seen how he treats us, with kindness, and he knows medicine." Thomas had indeed mentioned to Ruth that he had some medical knowledge from assisting a doctor in Boston during his university days, but that hardly qualified him for what they were asking. "I'm not a physician," he protested quietly. "Please," Ruth begged. "Dr. Reynolds won't come for slaves unless Master calls, and Master won't call for her. She'll die without help." The young woman on the pallet moaned, her hands clutching her swollen belly. Thomas approached hesitantly and knelt beside her. Her pulse was rapid, her skin burning with fever. "How long has she been in labor?" he asked Martha. "Since yesterday morning. Baby won't come and she's getting weaker." Thomas's mind raced through what little he knew about difficult births. "I need clean water, as many clean cloths as you can find, and if possible some whiskey or rum." While Martha gathered the supplies, Thomas gently examined Mercy. The baby was positioned incorrectly, a breech birth, which explained the prolonged labor. Without proper medical intervention, both mother and child would likely die. For the next 2 hours, Thomas worked desperately to help Mercy, guided by half-remembered instructions from the Boston doctor and Martha's experience as a midwife to the plantation's enslaved women. Ruth kept watch at the door, alert for any sign of discovery. Finally, with Mercy's last reserves of strength and Thomas's careful guidance, the baby, a tiny boy, was delivered. But the victory was short-lived. Mercy hemorrhaged severely, and despite their best efforts to stanch the bleeding, she slipped away as dawn approached, her son clutched to her chest. In the grey light of early morning, Thomas helped Martha prepare Mercy's body, while Ruth took charge of the newborn, who miraculously had survived. "What will happen to the child?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. Martha's expression hardened. "He'll be raised here among us until he's old enough to work. Then he'll be sold or put in the fields." "Unless Master decides otherwise," Ruth added cryptically. "What do you mean?" Martha shot Ruth a warning look, but the younger woman continued. "Some of the children born here, they go to the West Wing first." Before Thomas could question her further, Martha interrupted. "You need to get back to the house before they miss you. We've already risked too much." As Ruth led him back through the awakening plantation, Thomas's mind whirled with questions. What connection did the West Wing have to the children born to enslaved women? And why had Mercy been left to labor without medical attention when a doctor could easily have been summoned? They reached the kitchen just as the first servants were beginning their morning duties. Ruth quickly ushered him toward the servants' staircase. "Thank you," she whispered. "You tried to save her." "It wasn't enough," Thomas replied, the weight of his failure heavy on his conscience. Ruth's eyes, filled with a sorrow beyond her years, met his directly for the first time. "Nothing is ever enough here, Mr. Blackwood. Magnolia Manor takes and takes until there's nothing left to give." With those haunting words echoing in his mind, Thomas slipped back to his room, haunted by Mercy's death and the mysteries that seemed to deepen with each passing day at Magnolia Manor. The day after Mercy's death, Thomas found it difficult to focus on his teaching duties. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he caught Charlotte studying him with unusual intensity during their Latin lesson. "You look unwell, Mr. Blackwood," she observed during a pause in recitation. "Did you not sleep well?" "I had a restless night," Thomas admitted, unwilling to elaborate. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Elizabeth, who had been even quieter than usual that morning. "The house affects some people that way," Charlotte said carefully, "especially those not accustomed to our southern nights." There was something in her tone, a subtle probing, that made Thomas wonder how much the sisters knew about the events unfolding around them. Their lesson was interrupted by Frederick, who announced that Mr. Thornton required Thomas's presence in his study immediately. Making his way there with a sense of foreboding, Thomas found Thornton seated behind his massive desk, examining an open ledger with a frown. "Ah, Mr. Blackwood, close the door." Thomas complied, steeling himself for what might come. "I understand there was some commotion in the quarters last night," Thornton began without preamble, his fingers drumming against the ledger's pages. "One of the house slaves died in childbirth." Thomas maintained a neutral expression. "I hadn't heard, sir." Thornton's eyes narrowed slightly. "Haven't you? How curious when Martha reports that a man matching your description was present." A cold dread settled in Thomas's stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "I assure you, Mr. Thornton, I was in my room all night." "Were you indeed?" Thornton didn't press the issue directly, instead changing tack. "The child survived, I'm told. A boy." "That's fortunate," Thomas replied cautiously. "Indeed." Thornton closed the ledger with deliberate care. "Mr. Blackwood, let me be plain. My property is my concern. My slaves, their health, their offspring, all fall under my management, not yours. Whatever misguided northern sympathies you may harbor, I suggest you keep them to yourself." "I understand, sir." "Do you? Then understand this as well. I will not tolerate interference in my affairs." Thornton stood, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the desk. "Now return to your duties with my daughters. And remember, Mr. Blackwood, walls in old houses often have ears." Dismissed and shaken, Thomas returned to the library to find the sisters had been joined by their mother. Mrs. Thornton was instructing them on proper correspondence, her voice clipped and precise. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged his return with a cool nod, "the girls will be attending a gathering at the Pembrokes tomorrow evening. I expect them to be prepared to converse intelligently on current events and literature. Perhaps you could focus today's lessons accordingly." "Of course, Mrs. Thornton." After she departed, Thomas attempted to resume their studies, but his mind kept returning to Thornton's ledger. What records did it contain, and how did it connect to the mysteries of Magnolia Manor? That afternoon, when the sisters were occupied with their music lesson, Thomas made a decision. Slipping into the empty study, he quickly located the ledger Thornton had been examining. Opening it with trembling hands, he discovered not one, but two sets of records. The first appeared to be a standard plantation accounting, crops, expenses, purchases. But interspersed were entries in a different hand, recording births, ages, and cryptic notations. Some names were marked with a star, others with a cross. Mercy's name appeared on the final page, crossed out with infant male viable written beside it. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Thomas to replace the ledger hastily. He had just stepped away from the desk when Frederick entered. "Mr. Blackwood," the elderly butler said, surprise evident in his voice. "Can I assist you with something?" "I was looking for a volume on American history," Thomas improvised. "Mr. Thornton mentioned he had several in his collection." Frederick's expression suggested he didn't believe this explanation, but he merely replied, "The family's personal library is separate from the teaching library, sir. If you require additional books, please provide a list, and I will see what can be made available." As Thomas left the study, he felt Frederick's eyes following him. Another reminder that at Magnolia Manor he was constantly being watched. That evening at dinner, an unexpected guest joined the family. Dr. Reynolds, the physician Thomas had heard mentioned in connection with Mercy's plight. In his 60s, with a shock of white hair and round spectacles, the doctor carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. "Dr. Reynolds has come to check on Charlotte's condition," Mrs. Thornton explained as they took their seats. "A mild inflammation of the lungs, nothing serious," the doctor assured them jovially, "though the summer heat can exacerbate such conditions." Thomas hadn't noticed any respiratory symptoms in his elder pupil, but Charlotte nodded demurely. "And while I'm here," Dr. Reynolds continued, turning to Thornton, "I'll examine the new arrival as you requested." Thornton nodded curtly. "After dinner, I've had him brought to the West Wing in preparation." Thomas nearly dropped his fork. The new arrival could only be Mercy's infant son. But why would he be taken to the forbidden West Wing rather than remaining with the other enslaved people? And why did Charlotte need a doctor when she showed no signs of illness? As the meal progressed, Thomas observed the interactions around him with growing suspicion. Dr. Reynolds and Thornton spoke in veiled terms about the arrangement and previous successes, while Mrs. Thornton maintained her composure, occasionally glancing at her daughters with an unreadable expression. When the meal concluded, the men retired for brandy, excluding Thomas with pointed disregard. Left alone in the drawing room with Mrs. Thornton and the girls, Thomas ventured a carefully worded question. "I hope your health improves quickly, Miss Charlotte. Is your condition recent?" Before Charlotte could answer, Mrs. Thornton interjected. "Charlotte has always had delicate lungs, Mr. Blackwood. It's a family trait, unfortunately." "I see." Thomas turned to Elizabeth. "And you, Miss Elizabeth? Do you share this family trait?" The younger girl paled visibly. I don't know, sir." "Elizabeth has been blessed with robust health," Mrs. Thornton stated firmly. "Now, girls, it's time for your evening reading. Mr. Blackwood, you are free to retire for the evening." That night, Thomas lay awake, connecting the pieces of the puzzle before him. The forbidden West Wing, the doctor's visit, Mercy's child, the strange ledger entries, all pointed to something sinister occurring at Magnolia Manor. But the full picture remained elusive, just beyond his grasp. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, Thomas heard footsteps outside his door, heading toward the West Wing. Rising silently, he cracked his door open and glimpsed Dr. Reynolds and Thornton, deep in conversation as they walked away. "Best specimen yet," the doctor was saying. "If the mother had survived, we might have used her again." Their voices faded as they turned the corner, leaving Thomas with a growing sense of horror at what might be happening beyond the forbidden doors of Magnolia Manor's West Wing. The next morning brought stifling heat and a heavy atmosphere to the manor. Thomas's lessons with the girls were interrupted when Mrs. Thornton swept into the library, announcing that they would be preparing for the evening's social engagement earlier than planned. "The Pembrokes have moved their gathering to accommodate additional guests from Columbia," she explained. "The girls must look their best." Left with unexpected free time, Thomas decided to explore the grounds, hoping to speak with Ruth and learn more about Mercy's child. However, as he descended the main staircase, he encountered Frederick. "Mr. Blackwood," the butler said stiffly, Mrs. Thornton suggested you might enjoy a trip into town this afternoon. The carriage is being prepared." Thomas recognized the suggestion for what it was, a means of removing him from the property while whatever was happening in the West Wing continued. "That's very thoughtful, but I have correspondence to attend to. Perhaps another day." Frederick's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. Mrs. Thornton was most insistent. "In fact, she's arranged for you to meet with Professor Caldwell at the Charleston Athenaeum. He's expecting you at 2 o'clock. Caught in the Thorntons' machinations, Thomas had little choice but to comply. The carriage ride into Charleston took nearly an hour, during which he attempted to engage the driver in conversation, hoping to glean some information about Magnolia Manor's secrets. "How long have you worked for the Thornton family?" he asked casually. "Born on the property, sir," the man replied without turning. "Like my father before me." "Then you know the family well." "Know my place, sir," came the guarded response. "And the west wing of the house, what happens there?" At this, the driver stiffened visibly. "Not my business to know, sir, nor yours." The meeting with Professor Caldwell, clearly arranged as a distraction, consumed most of the afternoon. Though the professor was engaging and their discussion of educational philosophies stimulating, Thomas found his thoughts continuously returning to Magnolia Manor and its mysteries. By the time the carriage returned him to the plantation, evening was approaching. The house was quiet, the Thornton family having departed for their social engagement. Thomas seized the opportunity to seek out Ruth, hoping she might have news of Mercy's son. He found her in the kitchen, helping prepare the evening meal for the remaining household staff. When she saw Thomas enter, her eyes widened in alarm. "You shouldn't be here, sir," she whispered, glancing nervously at the other servants. "I need to speak with you," Thomas insisted. "About the child." Ruth's expression closed immediately. "I don't know anything about any child, sir." The other kitchen workers had fallen silent, watching their exchange with evident unease. Thomas realized he was endangering Ruth by approaching her so openly. "My apologies," he said, retreating. "I must have confused you with someone else." As he turned to leave, Martha entered the kitchen, her arms laden with linens. Seeing Thomas, she froze momentarily before continuing to a side door, deliberately bumping into him as she passed. "East Garden after dark," she murmured so quietly that only he could hear. Thomas spent the intervening hours in his room attempting to organize his thoughts and the evidence he had gathered. The ledger entries, the doctor's visit, Thornton's veiled threats, all pointed to something systematic and terrible occurring at Magnolia Manor. When night fell, Thomas made his way cautiously to the East Garden, a formal arrangement of roses and topiaries that offered numerous shadowed alcoves for a clandestine meeting. He found Martha waiting behind a large camellia bush, her expression grim in the faint moonlight. "You're a fool to keep asking questions," she began without preamble. "They'll send you away, or worse." "I need to know what's happening here," Thomas insisted. "What happened to Mercy's baby? Why was he taken to the West Wing?" Martha sighed heavily. "You still don't see it, do you? Mercy wasn't just any slave. She was valuable, specially selected." "Selected for what?" "For breeding," Martha spat the words. "Thornton has a system. He and that doctor choose women they think will produce desirable offspring. Strong boys who'll fetch high prices, or girls who might—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Girls who might continue the cycle." A cold understanding began to dawn on Thomas. The West Wing is where they examine them, test them, decide their worth. Martha's voice trembled with suppressed rage. "Mercy's boy will be raised in the house until he's old enough to be sold as a personal servant to one of Thornton's associates. He'll fetch triple the price of a field hand. And the girls in the quarters, the ones marked with stars in his ledger?" Martha's eyes widened slightly at his knowledge of the ledger. "Those are the ones they're watching, waiting until they're old enough to—" She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. The full horror of Magnolia Manor's secret business was becoming clear, a systematic program of human breeding conducted with the clinical precision of livestock husbandry, but inflicted upon people. "Does Mrs. Thornton know?" Thomas asked, thinking of her cold composure. Martha laughed bitterly. "No. She keeps the records, makes the selections with the doctor. The master provides the business connections, but she's the one who manages the inventory." Thomas felt physically ill. "And Charlotte and Elizabeth? How much do they know?" "Charlotte knows everything. She's being groomed to take over when her time comes." Martha's voice dropped even lower. "Elizabeth is kept more innocent, but she sees more than they think. That's why she's always so afraid." A sound from the house made them both tense. Martha stepped back into deeper shadow. "I've said too much already. If they knew I was talking to you—" "What can I do?" Thomas asked desperately. "This can't be allowed to continue." "Do?" Martha's voice was hollow. "There's nothing to be done. This is Charleston, Mr. Blackwood. The law protects men like Thornton, not those they enslave, not even northern tutors with inconvenient morals. There must be something—" "Leave," Martha interrupted sharply. "Leave Magnolia Manor before you become part of its secrets. That's the only advice I can give you." With that, she slipped away into the darkness, leaving Thomas alone with the weight of knowledge he now carried, and the impossible moral choice before him. Thomas spent a restless night, Martha's revelations haunting his attempts at sleep. By morning he had made a decision. He would not flee Magnolia Manor, not yet. Not while there might be a chance, however slim, of exposing the horrors taking place behind its pristine facade. The Thornton family returned late from their social engagement, allowing Thomas a quiet breakfast alone. When Charlotte and Elizabeth finally appeared for their lessons near midday, he noticed immediately that something had changed. Charlotte carried herself with even more rigid composure than usual, while Elizabeth seemed to have been crying, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. "Are you well, Miss Elizabeth?" Thomas asked gently as they settled in the library. The girl nodded wordlessly, avoiding his gaze. "We're both perfectly well, Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte answered for her sister, "merely tired from last night's activities. Shall we continue with our French translation?" Throughout the lesson, Thomas observed the sisters carefully. Charlotte maintained her perfect recitation, but there was a brittleness to her performance today. Elizabeth, meanwhile, struggled more than usual, her hands trembling slightly as she turned pages in her book. When Charlotte excused herself briefly to retrieve a forgotten notebook, Thomas took the opportunity to speak directly to Elizabeth. "If there's anything troubling you, Miss Elizabeth," he said quietly, "anything at all, I hope you know you can confide in me." The girl looked up, fear and something like hope warring in her expression. "You don't understand," she whispered. "No one can help us." "Elizabeth," Charlotte's voice cut through the room as she returned, sharper than Thomas had ever heard it. "Remember what Mother says about inappropriate conversations." Elizabeth immediately retreated into herself, ducking her head over her book. Charlotte cast Thomas a warning glance that seemed far too old and knowing for a 16-year-old girl. That afternoon, Thornton summoned Thomas to his study once more. The plantation owner was in an expansive mood, drinking brandy despite the early hour and smoking a cigar. "The Pembrokes' gathering was most successful," he announced without preamble. "Charlotte made an excellent impression on young Henry Pembroke, a potential match of significant advantage to both families." Thomas nodded politely, concealing his revulsion at the idea of Charlotte being married off so young, especially given what he now knew about the family business she was being groomed to inherit. "I've been considering your position here, Mr. Blackwood," Thornton continued. "Your academic credentials are impressive, but I wonder if a man of your northern sensibilities is truly suited to preparing my daughters for their roles in Charleston society. Have you found my teaching inadequate, sir?" Thomas asked carefully. "Not inadequate, perhaps, but possibly misaligned with our values." Thornton studied him through a haze of cigar smoke. "Tell me, what are your views on the peculiar institution that supports our way of life here in the South?" It was a trap, carefully laid. To express his true abolitionist sympathies would mean immediate dismissal, possibly worse. To claim support for slavery would compromise his soul. "I believe my role is to educate your daughters in academic subjects, Mr. Thornton," Thomas replied diplomatically. "Political and economic matters are best left to their parents' guidance." Thornton laughed, a sound without warmth. "Skillfully evaded, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps you have more southern subtlety than I credited you with." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "But make no mistake, I am watching you closely. Any hint of inappropriate influence on my daughters will be met with severe consequences." "I understand perfectly, sir." "Good." Thornton waved him away. "You may go." That evening, as Thomas prepared for bed, a folded piece of paper was slipped beneath his door. Opening it cautiously, he found a message in careful, childish handwriting. "Library, third bookcase from window. Behind, Principles of Natural Philosophy. Help us. E." Thomas's heart raced. Elizabeth had taken an enormous risk in reaching out to him. Whatever she wanted him to find must be significant. He waited until the house fell silent before venturing out, moving through the darkened corridors with exquisite care. The library door creaked slightly as he opened it, causing him to freeze momentarily, but no other sounds followed. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, providing just enough illumination to navigate between the looming bookcases. Thomas found the third case and ran his fingers along the spines until he located Principles of Natural Philosophy, a massive tome that few would have occasion to remove. Behind it, tucked into the space between the book and the back of the shelf, was a small leather-bound journal. Taking it carefully, Thomas retreated to where the moonlight was strongest and began to read. The journal belonged to Elizabeth, its pages filled with her observations of life at Magnolia Manor, observations far more perceptive and disturbing than one would expect from a 14-year-old girl. She wrote of overheard conversations between her parents, of midnight visits to the West Wing, of young women from the quarters who were brought to the house and later returned, changed, broken. Most chilling were her descriptions of Charlotte's transformation over the past year, how her sister had gradually been inducted into the family's secret business, taught to view the enslaved people as mere commodities, groomed to eventually take her mother's place as keeper of the ledgers and selector of breeding stock. Elizabeth's final entries revealed her deepest fear, that she herself was being prepared for a similar role, one she desperately wished to escape. She wrote of her mother's increasing attention to her development, of clinical discussions with Dr. Reynolds about her potential, of hints that she might soon be expected to observe the examinations in the West Wing. The journal's last entry, dated just the previous day, read simply, "They want Charlotte to marry Henry Pembroke. They want me to stay here and learn mother's work. I cannot become like them. I will not. If no help comes, there is the river. God forgive me." Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling with both rage and determination. Elizabeth was contemplating suicide rather than becoming complicit in her family's monstrous enterprise. He had to act, and quickly. But what could one tutor do against the entrenched power of a wealthy plantation owner in antebellum South Carolina? As he carefully replaced the journal behind the book, Thomas heard a floorboard creak behind him. Turning slowly, he found Charlotte standing in the library doorway, a candle in her hand, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I knew she'd reach out to you eventually," she said softly, entering the room and closing the door. "Elizabeth always was the weaker of us, the more sentimental. Is that what you call basic human decency?" Thomas asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Sentiment?" Charlotte's composure wavered slightly. "You don't understand. None of this was my choice. This is the world we were born into. But you can choose not to perpetuate its evils." "Can I?" Charlotte laughed bitterly. "Where would I go? What would I do? A Southern lady has no independent means, Mr. Blackwood. I either marry and become my husband's property, or I remain here and do what is expected of me. And what about the women in the quarters? Don't they deserve choices too? Charlotte flinched. I never said it was right. I just said it was the world as it exists. Worlds can change, Thomas insisted, but it takes courage to change them. For a moment, something like longing flashed across Charlotte's face, a glimpse of the girl she might have been in a different life, with different parents. Then her expression hardened again. You've read her journal. You know too much now. Her voice was flat, resigned. Father will dismiss you, perhaps worse. Unless you tell him. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. Are you asking me to lie? To betray my family? I'm asking you to help save your sister, Thomas said gently, and perhaps yourself as well. Charlotte stood silent for a long moment, the candle flame casting dancing shadows across her troubled face. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. They plan to send Elizabeth to the West Wing tomorrow to observe her first examination. She swallowed hard. If you truly mean to help her, to help any of us, it must be before then. With those words, she turned and left the library, the door closing silently behind her, leaving Thomas alone with the weight of his knowledge and the urgent need for action. Dawn had barely broken when Thomas heard the soft knock at his door. Opening it cautiously, he found Elizabeth standing there, pale and trembling in her nightgown, a shawl clutched around her shoulders. "They're coming for me after breakfast," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Mother says it's time I learned my responsibilities." Thomas ushered her inside quickly, closing the door. "Your sister told me. We need to get you away from here." "But how?" "Where would I go?" The desperation in Elizabeth's voice tore at Thomas's heart. "They'd find me. Father has connections everywhere in Charleston." "Not in Boston," Thomas said firmly. "I have family there who would help you." Hope flickered briefly in Elizabeth's eyes before dying. "It's impossible. The distance, the danger. And what about the others? Ruth, Martha, Mercy's baby." Her concern for those even more vulnerable than herself, despite her own peril, strengthened Thomas's resolve. One step at a time. First, we need evidence of what's happening here. Something that can't be denied or covered up. "The ledgers," Elizabeth suggested. "Mother's private ones, not just Father's business records. And Dr. Reynolds keeps detailed notes about the examinations." "Where are they kept?" "In the West Wing, in the room they call the office." Elizabeth shuddered visibly. "But no one goes in there except Mother, Father, and the doctor." Thomas considered their limited options. "Is there a time when the West Wing will be empty today?" Elizabeth thought for a moment. "After breakfast, Mother and Father are meeting with Mr. Pembroke about Charlotte's potential engagement. Dr. Reynolds won't arrive until midday." "Then that's our window," Thomas decided. "I'll search the West Wing while everyone is occupied. You should stay in the library. Act as normally as possible." "And then what?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small. "Then we get these records to someone who can help." Thomas wasn't entirely sure who that someone might be in pro-slavery Charleston, but he couldn't share his doubts with Elizabeth. "Perhaps a newspaper editor or a sympathetic lawyer." Elizabeth shook her head. "You don't understand Charleston, Mr. Blackwood. The people who could help won't. The people who would help can't." "Then we'll take the evidence north," Thomas insisted. "There are abolitionists who would ensure these crimes are exposed." They agreed on a plan. After breakfast, Thomas would use the confusion of the Pembroke visit to slip into the West Wing. Elizabeth would create a diversion if necessary, claiming to feel faint, a common enough occurrence for Southern ladies to raise no immediate suspicion. Breakfast that morning was a tense affair. Mrs. Thornton spoke enthusiastically about the Pembrokes' upcoming visit, while Charlotte maintained her perfect poise, occasionally casting guarded glances at her sister. Elizabeth picked at her food, her face pale but composed. Thornton, reading his morning newspaper, seemed preoccupied with business concerns. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Thornton addressed him suddenly, "the girls will be occupied with social obligations today. You may consider it a free day for your own pursuits." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. I have some correspondence to attend to. Perhaps in town, she suggested with pointed emphasis. Frederick can arrange the carriage. Thomas recognized another attempt to remove him from the property during whatever was planned for Elizabeth in the West Wing. I'm afraid some of my letters are quite urgent. I'll work here in my room, if that's acceptable. A flash of displeasure crossed Mrs. Thornton's face, but she merely nodded curtly. As you wish. Done. When breakfast concluded, the family dispersed to prepare for the Pembrokes' arrival. Thomas waited in his room, counting off minutes until he was certain Thornton and his wife would be occupied with their guests. Then, moving with deliberate care, he made his way toward the forbidden West Wing. The connecting door was locked, as he'd expected. However, Elizabeth had described an alternate route through a service corridor used by the house slaves when cleaning the rooms. Following her directions, Thomas found the unmarked door near the back stairs and slipped through. The air in the West Wing felt different, heavier, oppressive. The windows were covered with heavy draperies, allowing only thin slivers of light to penetrate the gloom. Thomas moved cautiously, aware that even at this hour a house slave might be present. The corridor opened into a large sitting room, furnished in the same elegant style as the rest of the house, but with a clinical austerity that sent chills down Thomas's spine. Beyond this lay several closed doors. Following Elizabeth's description, Thomas identified the one that should lead to the office. It was unlocked, a stroke of luck he hadn't dared hope for. Inside, he found a room dominated by a large desk and filing cabinet. The walls were lined with medical texts and bound journals, giving the space the appearance of a physician's private study. Thomas went straight to the desk, opening drawers until he found what he sought. A leather-bound volume, similar to the ledger he'd glimpsed in Thornton's study, but more detailed. This one contained names, physical descriptions, medical observations, and chillingly dispassionate assessments of breeding potential. Next to it lay a thinner volume, Dr. Reynolds's notes. Thomas flipped it open and immediately wished he hadn't. The clinical descriptions of examinations performed on young enslaved women, the detailed records of successful pairings, the tracking of pregnancies and evaluations of resulting children, all documented with scientific precision, as if the victims were livestock rather than human beings. Thomas's hands shook with rage as he gathered both books, along with several loose papers containing correspondence between Thornton and associates in other states, evidence of a network of similar operations across the South, trading in human beings specifically bred for domestic service or other specialized roles. As he turned to leave, a third book caught his eye, smaller, bound in red leather. Opening it, he discovered Mrs. Thornton's private journal, detailing her role in the family business with cold efficiency. Most disturbing were her notes on Charlotte's education and Elizabeth's resistance, including plans for the younger girl's introduction to her responsibilities, scheduled for that very afternoon. Thomas added this volume to his collection and moved toward the door, only to freeze at the sound of voices approaching from the corridor. One belonged to Mrs. Thornton, her tone sharp with irritation. "I don't care what Frederick says. The girl needs to begin her instruction today. The Pembrokes can wait." Trapped, Thomas looked frantically around the room for a hiding place. A heavy curtain covered what appeared to be a closet door in the corner. He slipped behind it just as the office door opened. "Really, Eleanor, this could have waited," came Thornton's exasperated voice. "Henry Pembroke is prepared to offer significant assets for Charlotte's hand. We shouldn't risk offending his father. Elizabeth's preparation cannot be delayed further." "Mrs. Thornton replied coldly. "She's already 14, the same age I was when my mother introduced me to the business. If she's to overcome her sentimental weaknesses, we must begin now." Through a small gap in the curtain, Thomas could see the Thorntons standing near the desk. Mrs. Thornton frowned suddenly, looking at the surface where the books had been. "The ledgers are missing," she said sharply. "And Reynolds's notes." Thornton approached the desk, his expression darkening. "They were here this morning when I reviewed them. Someone has been in here Mrs. Thornton's voice was dangerous now. "Check the other rooms. I'll call Frederick." As Thornton moved toward the far door, Mrs. Thornton pulled a cord to summon the butler. Thomas remained frozen behind the curtain, the incriminating books clutched to his chest, his heart pounding so loudly he feared they might hear it. His mind raced through possible escape routes, but they all seemed blocked. Even if he managed to slip out of the office, the wing would soon be swarming with searchers. And if he were discovered with the evidence, there was no telling what the Thorntons might do to protect their horrific enterprise. The sound of a commotion from the main house provided an unexpected reprieve. Frederick appeared at the door, his normally impassive face showing signs of agitation. "Madam, there's a situation requiring your immediate attention. Miss Elizabeth appears to have collapsed in the library. Miss Charlotte is quite distressed, and the Pembrokes are witnesses to the scene." Mrs. Thornton's expression shifted from anger to calculation in an instant. "A public incident would be most unfortunate. Elijah, continue searching here. I'll attend to the girls." As she hurried away, Thornton resumed methodically checking the room, moving ever closer to the curtained closet where Thomas hid. The tutor held his breath, knowing discovery was merely moments away when another interruption came. Ruth, appearing breathlessly at the door. "Master, come quick, there's fire in the kitchen quarters." Thornton hesitated, clearly torn between continuing his search and responding to the new crisis. "Fire? How severe?" "Spreading fast, sir. The slaves are trying to contain it, but—" "Damn it all!" Thornton strode toward the door. "Secure this wing. No one enters until I return." As his footsteps receded down the corridor, Thomas realized this might be his only chance. Moving swiftly from his hiding place, he crossed to the door and peered out cautiously. The corridor was momentarily empty. Ruth stood a few feet away, her eyes widening as she saw him emerge with the books. "Mr. Blackwood, Martha said you might be here. You need to hurry. The distraction won't last long." "Elizabeth, is she truly ill?" Thomas asked urgently. Charlotte helped her. "Made her drink something to bring on symptoms," Ruth explained rapidly. "But they'll be looking for you soon. You need to get those books away from here." Thomas nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Ruth, for everything." "Don't thank me yet, sir. You're still in the viper's nest." She gestured toward the service corridor. "That way is clear for now. I'll try to delay them if they come searching." With the damning evidence clutched tightly under his arm, Thomas slipped into the service corridor, hurrying toward what he hoped would be safety and justice for the victims of Magnolia Manor. The service corridor led Thomas back to the main part of the house, where chaos now reigned. Servants rushed about carrying buckets of water toward the kitchen wing, while others tried to maintain order among the startled house guests. Through an open door, Thomas glimpsed Elizabeth lying on a settee in the drawing room, Charlotte fanning her pale face, while Mrs. Thornton spoke soothingly to the concerned Pembrokes. Using the confusion as cover, Thomas made his way swiftly to his room, where he concealed the stolen ledgers and journals at the bottom of his traveling case. He then hurriedly packed his essential belongings, knowing he couldn't remain at Magnolia Manor a moment longer than necessary. The fire, while creating a useful distraction, also presented a problem. The commotion would make leaving the property difficult without attracting attention. Thomas needed to get himself, the evidence, and Elizabeth away from the plantation before the Thorntons discovered their secrets had been compromised. A soft knock at his door nearly stopped his heart. Opening it cautiously, he found Charlotte standing there, her perfect composure finally cracking around the edges. "They'll discover what you've done soon," she said without preamble, stepping into the room and closing the door. "The fire is being contained. Father will return to the West Wing within the hour." "How is Elizabeth?" Thomas asked urgently. "Recovering from her spell," Charlotte replied. "Mother believes it's merely nerves about her upcoming introduction to family responsibilities. She's ordered Elizabeth to rest in her room until this afternoon." Thomas studied Charlotte's face, searching for any sign of betrayal. "Why are you telling me this? Why help us after all this time defending your family's practices?" Charlotte's carefully constructed facade crumbled slightly, revealing the conflicted young woman beneath. Because Elizabeth was right about you. You're different. You see us, all of us, as people, not property or positions. She took a shuddering breath. And because I can't bear to watch my sister become what I've become. Come with us, Thomas urged impulsively. It's not too late for you either. Charlotte shook her head sadly. It is for me. I've already participated, observed, recorded. I'm complicit now. Her voice hardened with resolve. But Elizabeth can still be saved. And perhaps, through your evidence, some of the others as well. How can we get to Elizabeth and then off the property? The fire has drawn most of the household staff away from the main building. Elizabeth's room is at the end of the east corridor. Charlotte reached into her pocket and produced a small key. This opens the back garden gate. Beyond it is a path through the woods that leads to the river road. Half a mile downstream is the Jenkins farm. Old Mr. Jenkins is no friend to father. He might help you reach Charleston. Thomas took the key, overcome by Charlotte's unexpected assistance. What will happen to you when we're discovered missing? I'll claim ignorance, Charlotte said with a grim smile. I've become quite accomplished at playing the perfect southern daughter. No one will suspect I aided your escape. The ledgers implicate you as well, Thomas warned. Once exposed, your father's business will collapse. Your position in Charleston society will be ruined, Charlotte finished for him. Perhaps that's the price of redemption. She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. Wait 20 minutes, then go to Elizabeth. I'll ensure Mother is occupied with the Pembrokes until then. After Charlotte departed, Thomas completed his preparations, concealing the damning books within his clothing and bags to avoid detection if they were stopped. When the appointed time arrived, he made his way cautiously to the east corridor, passing several distracted servants without raising alarm. Elizabeth's door was unlocked. Inside, he found her sitting tensely on the edge of her bed, already dressed in a simple traveling outfit, a small valise beside her. Charlotte said you'd come, she whispered, rising immediately. Do you have them? The ledgers? Thomas nodded. Everything. Your sister gave me a key to the garden gate. There's a path. I know it, Elizabeth interrupted. I have dreamed of using it to escape more times than I can count, but never had the courage. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. Until you came. They moved quietly through the corridor, descending a rarely used side staircase that Charlotte had suggested. The garden door was unlocked as promised, leading them into the meticulously maintained formal garden with its high hedges providing cover from the main house's windows. As they neared the back gate, a voice called out sharply from behind them, "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Elizabeth!" They turned to find Frederick standing at the garden door, his elderly face set in lines of grim determination. "I cannot allow you to leave the property. Mr. Thornton would consider it a grave dereliction of my duties." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth. "Frederick, you know what happens in this house. You've served the family for decades. Surely you can't condone—" "I condone nothing," the butler interrupted, his voice suddenly weary. "I merely survive as we all do in our different ways." He approached slowly, hands visible to show he carried no weapon. "But the question now is not what I condone, but what I will permit." Elizabeth clutched Thomas's arm fearfully. "Please, Frederick, you've known me since I was born. You've watched what they're trying to make me become." For a long moment, Frederick stood silent, conflict evident in his aged eyes. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he stepped aside. "I saw nothing," he said quietly. "I was occupied with the fire in the kitchen quarters. By the time I thought to check on Miss Elizabeth, considerable time had passed." Relief washed over Thomas. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," Frederick replied sharply. "Just ensure that what you take from here serves justice, not merely scandal. There are many lives that hang in the balance, Mr. Blackwood, not just those of the Thornton family." With this enigmatic warning, Frederick turned and walked slowly back toward the house, his shoulders bowed as if carrying an invisible weight. Thomas unlocked the garden gate, and he and Elizabeth slipped through, hurrying down the overgrown path that led into the woods surrounding Magnolia Manor. The July heat was stifling under the canopy of trees, but fear propelled them forward, neither speaking until they had put considerable distance between themselves and the plantation. "They'll come after us," Elizabeth said, as they paused briefly at a small stream to drink. "Father won't let this evidence leave his control, and he certainly won't let me go without a fight." "Then we need to move quickly," Thomas replied, helping her across the slippery stones. "Once we reach Charleston, we can find passage on a northern ship. I have friends in Boston who will help us get these ledgers to people who can take action." Elizabeth looked doubtful. "Will it make a difference? Even with evidence, the laws protect men like my father." "Perhaps not in South Carolina," Thomas acknowledged. "But in the North, there are newspapers that will publish the truth. There are abolitionists with influence in Washington. What happens at Magnolia Manor and places like it must be exposed if there's ever to be change." They continued their flight through the woods, eventually emerging onto the river road Charlotte had described. In the distance, they could see the Jenkins farm, a modest property compared to the Thornton plantation, but their first hope of refuge. As they approached the farmhouse, however, Thomas's heart sank. Standing in the yard were two of Thornton's men on horseback, speaking with an elderly farmer who could only be Mr. Jenkins. Somehow, Thornton had anticipated their escape route. "We need to hide," Thomas whispered urgently, pulling Elizabeth back toward the tree line. "They're already searching for us." Elizabeth's face paled. "The river," she suggested desperately. "There's a fisherman's hut, about a quarter-mile downstream. We might find a boat." They kept to the trees, moving parallel to the road but out of sight of any searchers. Thomas could hear distant shouts as more of Thornton's men joined the search, spreading out across his vast property and beyond. The fisherman's hut proved to be abandoned, a simple wooden structure on stilts above the riverbank. Beneath it, partially hidden in the reeds, was an old, flat-bottomed boat, weathered but seemingly intact. "The river flows directly to Charleston," Elizabeth explained as they dragged the boat to the water's edge. "If we stay close to the bank and travel by night, we might avoid detection." Thomas helped Elizabeth into the boat, then pushed it into the slow-moving water, jumping in as it floated free of the bank. Using a pole he'd found near the hut, he guided them into the current, keeping close to the overhanging trees for concealment. As Magnolia Manor disappeared behind them, Elizabeth sat huddled in the bow, her face a mixture of terror and determination. "I never thought I'd actually leave," she whispered. "My whole life has been within those walls." "You're very brave," Thomas told her, meaning it sincerely. "Most people would have accepted their fate. Like Charlotte did." There was no accusation in Elizabeth's voice, only sadness. "Your sister made her choice," Thomas said gently, "and in the end, she helped us escape. Perhaps that's her form of resistance." As the afternoon faded into evening, they continued their journey downriver, the stolen ledgers and journals, evidence of Magnolia Manor's darkest secrets, secured between them. Behind them, they knew Thornton would be mobilizing every resource at his disposal to recover his daughter and the damning documentation of his crimes. The sun began to set over the river, casting long shadows across the water. In the distance, the lights of Charleston beckoned, a promise of possible safety, but also the center of the society that enabled the horrors of Magnolia Manor to exist. Thomas and Elizabeth's journey was far from over, and the dangers ahead remained numerous and grave. Yet in the gentle rocking of the boat, with the evidence of truth in their possession and the determination of justice in their hearts, there existed a fragile hope that perhaps the shadows of Magnolia Manor might finally be exposed to the cleansing light of day. This was only the beginning. The darkness continues in part 2. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.